Hi, this is Ben Kissling, and this is episode 11 of my video series on William Lane Craig and Genesis. Today we're discussing still parts 15 and 16, loosely discussing parts 15 and 16 of Craig's video and lecture series called Defenders 3, Excursus on Creation of Life and Biological Diversity. This is Aging and the Flood Part 4. This will be the last episode on this subject, I promise. If you recall, in parts 15 and 16 of Craig's Sunday school class, there was a lot of questions and discussion about the old ages recorded in Genesis 5. So I've been spending a lot of time talking about how I think that could have occurred. How could people live to be that old? How could they have lived forever in the Garden of Eden, as the text implies? And also, how was it that they declined so quickly in ages after the flood? So we did a lot of discussion about that. But today, I'm really more interested in why. Why would God do this? God planned all this out. I believe this is part of God's plan. So the question is why? Why would God create man and earth and everything only to destroy it roughly 1600 years later in a global flood? But there are other questions that are similar to this in Scripture that I didn't really set out to explain or even think about when I started this episode. Including a similar question as to why God ordered the Israelites, the ancient Israelites, to wipe out the Canaanites. It's almost a similar situation where the Canaanites were doing something that God really, really didn't like, and he needed them to be gone for some reason. And there isn't a lot of clues in Scripture as to why this occurred or why God wanted this to happen. So we're going to ask that question today. And I have an interpretation that started with Genesis 6, but went much farther than that, farther than I intended it to go, really. But I kept thinking about it, and it kept making more and more sense. So obviously, in general, it was actually human beings who destroyed creation. They sinned against God. They started doing things that God didn't want them to do, that were against His will, and they messed everything up. And then they turn and have the audacity to blame God for destroying the creation when they were the ones who did it. But God is, in this narrative, I believe, trying to fix things. He is not the destroyer. He is the fixer. And we're going to look at why that might be the case. So Genesis 6 has been the first verses of Genesis 6 have been very controversial since long before the controversy over the age of the earth. People argued about what this passage means a long, long time ago because it's very cryptic, as we'll see. But I wanted to show you what you can potentially gain by taking the text at face value and believing that at the very least, believing that the people who wrote it believed that this was true history and what they thought all this meant and why they wrote it the way they did. I'm going to give an interpretation that I think is very profitable and very interesting and illuminating for much of the Old Testament. Again, and I didn't intend to go beyond this passage, but it just kept leading there. And so it's really very interesting what you can do, or what you can learn when you take the text at face value. And then this is also potentially beneficial for even non-Christians who don't believe that this is true history. If the people who wrote this believed that it was, obviously they were taking something out of it. What were they thinking about? And that's potentially interesting, even if you're not even a Christian, or if you're a Christian or who don't think that this is, true history, but are willing to consider at least that the authors thought that this was all true. Okay, so I'm going to read this real quick, and then we're going to go through the long list of questions about this very short passage. Now it came about when mankind began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit will not remain with man forever, because he is also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Wow, that escalated quickly. They're just marrying and having kids, and all of a sudden God says, what is going on? Anyway, the Nephilim. Who are they? Who are the Nephilim? The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God. Here's those sons of God again. Who are they? Are they the Nephilim? Are they the parents of the Nephilim? Are they the children of the Nephilim? Are they related at all? What's going on? The sons of God came to the daughters of mankind, and they bore children to them. Those, assuming the Nephilim, those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And then, of course, after this, we start the flood narrative for 4 chapters, Genesis 6 through 9. It talks about Noah and the flood. Okay, God destroys the earth and uses Noah to replenish the earth and Noah's Ark with all the animals after the flood. So what the heck is going on in this passage? Who are the sons of God? This is actually one of the biggest issues for scriptural interpretation generally, because the phrase the sons of God is used in many, many other scriptures. For example, Jesus is called the Son of God. There's a Psalm 82 is a big one that uses the phrase the sons of God, and there's many different interpretations of what that psalm means. It's a strange psalm. Who are the daughters of men? There's less controversy over this. Most people agree that this means human women. But it seems to set them apart from the sons of God. It seems to set up a contrast between the sons of God versus the daughters of men. And so this phrase is also important because it denotes human women as opposed to who? Who are the sons of God? Well, many people have suggested that the sons of God is a reference to fallen angels or demons. But if that's the case, then why are these angels taking human wives and having children with them? That doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's been a popular interpretation. Who were the Nephilim? Again, if you believe that the sons of God were fallen angels, then the Nephilim are demigods, basically. They're half angels, half human, or something like that. Others, sometimes even the same interpretation, suggests that the Nephilim were giants, are very large people. A race of people descended from perhaps even a specific union at some point. The term Nephilim suggests a group of people who are related to each other biologically, because other races are called. It's a Hebrew term for that. So there's the Anakim, we'll see some passages later that use the same kind of phrasing. I don't know what you would call it in Hebrew, but anyway. What does the 120 years refer to? Even that is controversial. There's different interpretations of what the 120-year period is referring to. Some Christians, even some young earth creationists, take the view that this is God saying this 120 years before the flood. And so he's basically saying, that's it, in 120 years I'm going to kill you all. And some people suggest that because in the New Testament Noah is referred to as a preacher, they suggest that God actually gave this message to Noah 120 years before the flood. and he preached for 20 years, repentance, repent, the end is nigh and all this, and nobody repented. So God then told Noah in the narrative of Genesis 6, God tells Noah 100 years before the flood to start building the ark. And so they say that there's 20 years of where Noah was preaching. But I actually think that it's referring to God limiting the lifespan of human beings to under 120 years. And the last person who dies in Genesis is Joseph. In the line, in the unbroken line from Adam that is recorded all the way through to Joseph in Genesis, Joseph is the first person who dies under the age of 120 years, at 110. Joseph's father, Jacob, is 147. Isaac is 185, I believe. Abraham lives to be 175. Everybody up until Joseph lives to be well over 120 years. And so the narrative in Genesis stops with Joseph. What were people doing that was so bad that necessitated God wipe them all out? That's kind of the main question of this episode. Again, related, why did God destroy all people but left Noah and his family alive? Is it really, the text indicates that Noah was a righteous man, and he was the only righteous man, but that seems kind of odd. How could he have been the only righteous person on the face of the whole earth? There could have been literally billions of people alive by this time because of the old ages and the fact that everybody was probably having babies the entire time. We'll get to some of that. So why kill everyone but Noah? Why are the great numbers of humans mentioned in Genesis 6? This is often glossed over in interpretations, but I think this is a weird thing to include in this passage. Why? Because God specifically ordered human beings to multiply on the earth. Okay, so what? Why is that a big deal? Well, this passage is clearly a passage of judgment. It's telling us that the people, the antediluvian society, the antediluvian human beings, were evil, and they were so evil that God had to destroy them all. But one of the things that is mentioned is they multiplied greatly on the earth. But isn't that exactly what God told them to do? So why would the author of this passage specifically mention that there's lots of people on the earth? And this is mentioned twice in the passage. It says people greatly multiplied on the earth. They had sons and daughters, and they had lots of children and all this. It's mentioned several times. It's just kind of strange. Unless that has something to do with why they were evil. I'm going to suggest that in a second. Again, and this is all related to why are all these things in the same passage? There's many views that plausibly make sense of all the details in the passage, but arguably don't put it all together into a single narrative. They're just disparate pieces of information that God is or the author is sort of randomly throwing in there. It's kind of weird. If it's not all related, what are all these things doing in this one short little passage? I'm going to suggest there's a way to make sense of all these pieces of information that was naturally understood by the ancient Israelites. Okay, to whom this book Genesis is addressed. Okay. What might it mean? Okay, so we're going to get into this. Now, as I said before, most people, if you ask most Christians, they would say the sons of God here are fallen angels or demons. But one interpretation that says this is not novel is that the sons of God is a term that means human political leaders, kings. I'm going to call them tribal leaders. But one thing I'm going to emphasize is that they were likely very, very old tribal leaders, several hundred years old. And this makes a huge difference between antediluvian society and tribal society that we know about today. Why? Because if you're a 700 or 800-year-old tribal leader, you can have lots and lots and lots of kids. Okay? Now, just to give you an idea of how many people could have been in these tribes under one very old tribal leader, it's been estimated that Genghis Khan is the ancestor of something like 5% of the world population today. Now the world population is somewhere between 7 and 8 billion. I don't know the current estimates. But 5%, 10% is 700 million. So 5% would be half of that. 350 million people descended from Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan was born in the 13th century. So today, he would be about 800 some years old. He would still be alive if this was the antediluvian society. And he could potentially have 350 million people directly tracing their ancestry to him. Now imagine how powerful that would make somebody like that. 300 million some people knowing and being able to trace directly through living ancestors, okay, people who were alive, grew up the son of Genghis Khan, had their own kids, live 500, 600, 700 years, and tell all their descendants that Genghis Khan is their father and they're loyal to him, and therefore all their kids should be loyal to Genghis Khan too, and all the rest. I mean, it's insane how much power these sons of God could have had, if that's in fact what this term refers to. Nothing like it exists in human society today. It's almost unimaginable the kind of power those people could have had if that's indeed what is being talked about here. Now, the term the Son of God could have been originally applied to Adam because Adam had no human father. So they would say, well, he's the Son of God, is Adam, right? But you could then say that, well, the tribal leaders who were built up their own tribes began to take on this title, the Son of God, as a title that meant we're the ancestor of all these people, right? And it could even be the case that potentially after Adam died, Adam lived 930 years, we're told, that the sons of God began to sort of squabble amongst themselves and fight over who should be the heir of this title, the Son of God. And so perhaps the plural sons of God indicates disputes among these tribal leaders as to who should be the real quote-unquote Son of God as the successor to Adam. So I think the plural term sons of God denotes or implies conflict among these tribal leaders. So if there is conflict among the tribal leaders, the very first thing that would happen if you got in a war, for example, is you would realize that the strength of your army is the size of your family. Quite literally, your survival would depend on how many descendants you have. And not just armies, but also farmers, the people who grow all your food. You need as many of those as you can to support a large army. You need to support a large tribe. You need to, and the more land you need for farming, the more soldiers you need to protect it. And so they would have realized very, very quickly that your power as a tribal leader is based on how many people you have underneath you who are loyal to you. And the most loyal you can be to someone is to be their son, okay, or their direct descendant. So imagine a situation in this ancient tribe where you have a 700 or 800-year-old tribal leader who literally is in charge of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people, controls vast territory, is in a centuries-long war of annihilation with other similar tribes, knowing that if you lose, you're all going to be slaughtered or enslaved. And so you have to have as many kids as you can. Well, in the passage it says the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. Okay? And so what I'm going to suggest is that this difference between the sons of God and daughters of men is a difference in age and power in the tribe. And also the fact that they were their daughters by several generations perhaps, but definitely descended from them. And so they took the daughters of men, meaning the daughters of several generations removed from themselves. So you're talking great, 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 great granddaughters or something like that. And they said, look at these young women, they're beautiful, I'm going to take them as a wife. Okay, and so they probably had these large harems, which served the dual purpose of satisfying their sexual desires, but also as broodmares, breeding lots of direct sons to the tribal leader, which I believe would serve as the warrior class of the tribe. Now, it makes sense for a tribal leader to have the warrior class, his enforcers, be the most loyal to him out of the whole tribe. And so the sons of God, the tribal leaders, would want the most important, powerful people in the tribe to be their direct sons, not their great, 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 great grandsons that might have their loyalties divided. Okay? So I'm gonna suggest that the Nephilim were a class of people who were the direct sons of the tribal leader, the direct sons of the sons of God. And that seems to be implied directly by the passage. But it's in the context of a massive tribe where there are lots and lots and lots of people who were not direct sons of the tribal leader. And so the other thing that is going to be, I think, the key to my interpretation, and is not directly indicated in the text, this is an interpretation, is that after centuries and centuries of struggle and warfare, of trying to survive against other tribes, trying to take over other tribes, the sons of God and the daughters of men together had figured out what every farmer, livestock breeder has figured out in history, is that when you selectively breed for certain traits, you can get entire races or breeds of livestock, of crops that exhibit certain traits that you want. And I'm suggesting that they notice this about human beings. And there's no particular reason why they would not have done this with humans as they did with livestock. Okay? And so I'm going to suggest that the Nephilim were the specific products of centuries-long selective breeding program or eugenics program prior to the flood, and were bred for size and strength, to be the enforcer class of the tribes, to be the warriors that won battles and protected the tribe and enforced the authority of their direct father, the Son of God, of the tribe. Okay? Now, that's a lot of interpretation there, but stick with me. There are some good reasons for thinking this. But an implication of this is that perhaps, since they were all part of this tribe and were all part of the ancestral genealogy of this one tribal leader, what if everybody was bred for the role that they were supposed to play in the tribe? Okay, the Nephilim would be bred to be warriors, and they would be the direct sons of the tribal leader. But everybody else may have been bred for different roles. Maybe the daughters of men themselves was a title for women who were bred specifically to be broodmares. What if there were farmers who were bred to be farmers, hunters who were bred to be hunters, builders who were bred to be builders. They would notice things, physical attributes of humans that were advantageous to this or that occupation, and took that person. The tribal leader would say, "Look, you have this and this physical characteristic. This makes you a great warrior, or this makes you a great blacksmith, or whatever, or musician, or who knows. I'm going to breed you. I'm going to give you this wife, and you breed these people for this purpose." And this could have created a systemic genetic caste system where people were literally bred into their roles in life, and even whether or not they wanted to, they would be forced into a certain occupation. We're talking a rigid class system, so rigid that literally breaking out of your caste would mean rebelling against hundreds of centuries of planning by the most powerful people on earth. So it is unlikely there could have been anybody who could have successfully rebelled against this system. Okay? Now, who else has attempted this sort of thing? Well, there's been one specific instance of this thing being attempted in the 20th century. We all know the results of that. This is a very undesirable situation. Literally, this is like the Nazis winning World War II and taking over the whole world. If you've seen the Man in the High Castle series, it's a really great television series I'd recommend. It actually gets into some of this, of what this kind of society would look like. And so this gives a reason for why God would wipe them all out, why we would kill them all, even if many of them may have been themselves unable to do anything about this. God is wiping out a genetic caste system, meaning that by killing everyone, he's destroying the plans of these tribal leaders that have bred people into specific roles. And God doesn't want this to happen. God doesn't want human society to be like this. Okay? And the only way you can change a genetic caste system is by starting over completely. Now, that's pretty harsh, but, I mean, how else would you do that? Again, I'm not interested in the apologetic at this point. There's lots of people who have dived into the apologetics of this sort of thing. I'm interested in textual interpretation right now. Okay? Now we get to the other weird thing about the passage. And this is really the capstone of this argument. Okay? Again, I'm arguing that when God says the years of man will be 120 years, I am arguing that this is a term limit to human beings. Okay? In order for the flood to be successful in wiping out this antediluvian society that God did not want, what prevents this whole thing from happening again after the flood? How does it not just all happen again the same way? It would not happen again if, and only if, human beings did not live to be centuries and centuries old. If you don't live to be 900 years old, you can't have hundreds and thousands of children, and you can't have hundreds of millions of direct descendants while you're still alive. That really makes sense of why God would plan out that human beings can't live as long after the flood. He's trying to prevent what happened before from happening again. And this is going to come up again and again in this episode. Okay? There's a very bad society that grows up in the antediluvian world. God destroys it all, he starts over, and then he takes several steps to make sure that it can't ever happen again. And one of those steps is to make sure that human beings can't live long enough. Okay? Now, continuing on, note that in the genealogies in Genesis, shortly after the flood, people do not immediately go down to under 120 years. As I said before, it takes all the way until Joseph before that specific line has even a single human male who dies before 120 years. So there are several generations where Shem lives to be 600 years after the flood. His next 3 generations after him live to be about 400 years old. So this sort of thing could have been happening to a lesser extent even after the flood, while God is sort of waiting for human ages to go all the way down to where he wants them to go. Okay? So there is potentially a problem that God might have to intervene to resolve shortly after the flood, before the term limit takes effect. And that explains, I think, the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11, which occurs right after the flood narrative. Okay? And they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let's make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of all the earth." Now the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the men had built, and the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they have started to do. And now nothing which they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Okay, now this is in the period shortly after the flood. Many commentators say something perhaps in the range of 100 years after the flood. And God notices that they are one people. They are conglomerating together in one place. They're living in the same area, and they're going to build this huge tower. They're going to say, "We're not going to be scattered over the face of the earth." We know God wants them to be scattered over the face of the earth and fill the whole earth. That's earlier in Genesis. That's his goal for them. But also, when he says nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them, obviously he doesn't mean that in sort of the modern legalistic sense that, well, they can do anything they want. I'm suggesting that what God is saying here is that even though he destroyed the pre-flood, the antediluvian society, if he allowed them to stay in one place and build this one city together, that they could recreate the antediluvian society and have a centralized authority that has the kind of power over human society that he wanted to prevent. And so he was acting here, I'm suggesting, interpreting this, at the Tower of Babel to make sure that they were spread out so that power was dispersed. And so before human lifespans get down to where they need to be, God intentionally intervenes to make sure that they can't accumulate too much power in one place and recreate the antediluvian world. Okay? So this, I'm arguing, is related to the same reason why God brought the flood in the first place. And I haven't really seen another interpretation that does that makes sense of both of these stories together. This introduces the idea that God uses nations as checks and balances against each other, which is evident throughout the Old Testament. God separates people into different nations so that they cannot accumulate so much power that they can do the kinds of things that the antediluvian peoples did, right up to the genetic caste system and selective breeding and all of that. Okay, he doesn't want that, so he uses the nations to make sure that if one nation gains too much power, he can use the other nations to beat them down and take them out and prevent them from doing things he doesn't want them to do. Okay? In Genesis 12, you'll note that part of the promise that God gives to Abraham is that God is going to use Abram to bless all the nations of the earth, all of them. Now, that's interesting because here in Genesis 11, human beings are trying to be one nation, and they're trying to look after themselves and make a name for themselves, be their own boss, basically. And God says, no, you know what? You're not going to be in charge of this. I am. In Genesis 12, God says, I'm going to bless the nations. You guys can't be trusted to run the world. Okay? So I'm going to run the world. I'm going to make sure that you are blessed in the way that I want you to be, so that you don't take this on yourself and screw it up, basically. So I even think now that this promise to Abraham is related to Genesis 11 in a way that's really illuminating. In Genesis 15, God tells Abram the future, especially verse 16. Note, this is where, again, God emphasizes to him, and this is, by the way, this is also part of the promise in Genesis 12. That's God is going to give Abram's descendants a specific land, the promised land, right? This is where your descendants are going to go. This is where they're going to live. But in Genesis 15, he says, you're going to go down, your descendants are going to go down to Egypt. They're going to live there for 400 years, and then they're going to come back up here and take the land. Because, why? This is literally, in all of Scripture, the only reason we get ever from God about why the promised land is in Canaan. Okay? And why he tells the Israelites to wipe out the Canaanites. It says, the wrongdoing of the Amorites is not yet complete. There is something terrible that the Amorites are going to do in the future. They haven't done it when God tells Abraham this. Abram is changed to the name Abraham is also in the future of Genesis 17. But there's something that these people are going to do that is so bad that he is going to use the Israelites to wipe them out, just like he wiped out the people prior to the flood. Is it the same thing the antediluvian peoples were doing? Is it the same thing people were trying to do at the Tower of Babel that God intervenes to prevent? He's intervening here in Canaan, okay, to prevent something. And fundamentally, I'm arguing that what God is intervening in human society to prevent is humans doing the same thing that they did before the flood and messing everything up. And the main thing I'm arguing, again, this is interpretation. What they did before the flood was they engaged in selective breeding, tried to breed people in order to gain power, basically. Okay? Which leads us to the question, who were the Nephilim? Now, this is a passage from Numbers. And if you remember your Sunday school lesson, 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 saw bad and 2 saw good, right? What did they see when they spied on Canaan? 10 saw bad and 2 saw good. Some saw giants great and tall. Some saw grapes in clusters fall, right? And you can finish the song yourself. But this is the time when the Israelites had come out of Egypt. Okay, this is the time that God told Abraham would occur. They're coming into the promised land, and they send out 12 people to go out into the land and see what's going on there. But 10 of those 12 said, we are not able to go up against the people because they are too strong for us. So they brought a bad report of the land which they had spied out to the sons of Israel, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it, are people of great stature. They're large. We also saw the Nephilim there. This is the only other time in Scripture the word Nephilim is mentioned, other than Genesis 6. The Nephilim there, the sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. These people are physically bigger than us, and we cannot beat them. Now, if you know anything about ancient warfare, okay, they didn't have guns, they didn't have missiles, they had swords and spears, and being physically large means you are going to be way better at killing people than smaller people. Okay? And so they were afraid. They said, we can't go in and fight these people. They're going to crush us. They're so big. Okay? Now, some people have argued that this is a false report. Some young Earth creationists have argued this, that these spies were lying about this, that there weren't large people there, or that they were exaggerating or something. And they argue this because they think the word Nephilim means a race of people that are related to the antediluvian Nephilim, okay, which is impossible because the flood killed everybody except Noah. There can't be Nephilim around because they were wiped out in the flood, right? So they say, well, these people were obviously lying or exaggerating. I'm going to say that the word Nephilim here is not necessarily referring to a specific race, but they're saying that they understood that term Nephilim in Genesis to mean, or they had these other stories and legends or whatever that the Genesis was written about, where they understood the term Nephilim to mean a large warrior class, a people who were physically larger and capable warriors, and who may have been related to each other, and will, again, I think by selective breeding, this is how this happens. And so they're like the Nephilim. They are the Nephilim. They maybe weren't able to tell the difference between that and the Nephilim. They were just saying, these people are large. Okay? We can't beat them in war. Okay? Now, why would it be important? Let's ask this question. Why would it be important for God specifically to intervene in human history and make sure that these Canaanites get wiped out? What if nobody else could have done it? Because they were of great stature, because they were large and everybody was afraid of them, because they were so good at warfare. We'll look at this later. There's other scriptural evidence that this is potentially the case. Okay. When they had gone up into the Negev, they came to Hebron, where blah 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 blah. The descendants of Anak are also considered to be large people. The descendants of Anak. This is in Numbers. Now this is in Deuteronomy, which is after the 40 years of wandering. Now remember, after the 12 spies come back and the 10 say, we can't beat these people, the Israelites rebel against Moses and they say, we're not going to go in there because they'll kill us all. And Moses says, are you idiots? And Caleb and Joshua, the other two spies, right, say, no, we can take them. But no, the rest of the people don't believe them, and so God condemns them to wander 40 years in the desert until that generation dies off, and the next generation he then brings into the promised land with only Caleb and Joshua still alive, and Moses is alive, but God doesn't allow him to go in. And so this is Moses' final speech to the Israelites before they go into Israel, or to the land of Canaan, the promised land, to take it over. And Moses is telling them, reminding them of what happened 40 years earlier. You grumbled in your tents and said, because the Lord hates us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt to hand us over to the Amorites. Remember, the Amorites are referred to in Genesis 15. To destroy us. Where can we go up? Our brothers have made our hearts melt by saying the people are bigger and taller than we. The cities are large and fortified up to heaven. Now, why is that phrase interesting? Fortified up to heaven. Because that is the same phrase that is used in Genesis 11 about the Tower of Babel. They said, we will build this building to reach up to heaven. I think Moses here is making a reference to the Tower of Babel story. Okay? Or whoever wrote this. This may have been someone else. But I certainly think Moses spoke this. He is referencing that this is the antediluvian world trying to take hold of the earth after God expressly prevented it with the flood and destroyed these people. Okay? He's referencing the antediluvian world to remind the Israelites that God is in authority over them. even despite that they are large, like the Nephilim, despite that they have large fortified cities up to heaven. Okay, that's really interesting. And there's another reference to a large people that are apparently of a different ethnicity than the Anakim, sons of Anak. A people who are great and tall, Deuteronomy 9, the sons of Anakim. Okay, who can stand against them? Okay, but God can stand against them. He is crossing over the Jordan ahead of you as a consuming fire. He will destroy them. He will subdue them before you so that you may drive them out and eliminate them quickly, just as the Lord has spoken to you. Moses is saying, you are to eliminate these large people. Now, if I'm correct, that's exactly what God was doing at the flood. He was eliminating a race of people who had been bred for war and bred to be large and physically stronger than everybody else, and a society that had grown up under their control. Okay? This is the same thing that God is using the Israelites to do here, to go into Canaan and destroy these large people so that they cannot take over, essentially, the world. All right? Now, there is independent extra-biblical evidence that there were, in fact, excessively large people in Canaan at this time. There is an ancient Egyptian text that was found of an Egyptian traveler who traveled into the land of Canaan, came back to Egypt and wrote this down from exactly the time of the Exodus. An Egyptian who traveled to Canaan. In this text, this is called Papyrus Anastasi 1. The picture here is not actually of Anastasi 1. I couldn't find a picture of Anastasi 1. This is a picture of Anastasi 5. So I'm assuming it looks roughly the same, unless you can read Egyptian hieroglyphics. But in the Anastasi 1 text, it says he saw people in Canaan who were 4 to 5 cubits from toe to nose. Now, this is the Egyptian long cubit, which is 20.7 inches roughly. Slightly different estimates, but that's an average of them. And that gives a height of 4 to 5 cubits, not to the top of your head, but from toe to your nose, of 6.9. That's a decimal. I probably should have converted that to inches, but 6.9 to 8.6 feet. Could be as high as 8.5 feet from toe to nose. Now that is really, really big. And if you look at the Wikipedia entry on this, it will say these people were as much as 7 feet. But, of course, that is the low end of this range that is given in the actual text itself. The high end of the range is over 8.5 feet, and that's only to your nose. Obviously, you're several inches higher counted by modern counting to the top of your head. Okay? Now, we also are told much, much later in the book of Samuel that Goliath of Gath, who David killed famously, was 9 foot 9 inches. And this is by a different measuring system. I believe this was, I'm not 100% sure, but there is some disagreement over this height. Some people say that the measurement here means 6 foot something. But typically this is interpreted as to be 9 foot 9 inches, which is an incredibly large human, but it would only be a little bit out of the range of this ancient Egyptian text. So this was not out of the question for ancient people to believe this. Now, there's potentially a reason why God never said in the Bible, I want you to kill these people because they're super big. And that's because it's not a sin to be really big. Some people are very large, and it's not their fault, right? They're not sinners, they're not evil, they're not the spawn of Satan. It's just some people happen to be larger than others. It just happens. That's not the problem. Okay, the problem is not that they're large. The problem is the society that is selectively breeding human beings to be large, and the reason why they are doing it. That's the problem, and that is what God has to prevent from happening. Okay, and it is interesting. One thing we do know, that my interpretation here is speculative. But one thing we do know about the Canaanite gods is that basically all of them were fertility gods. And what is important about fertility gods? Well, if you're going to selectively breed an entire population to be large humans and warriors, fertility would be very important to you. You would need massive amounts of babies in order to pick the babies that you don't want and kill them, okay, and only grow the humans that are as large as you want. Okay, so fertility would be extremely important, and not only that, but you would want to make sure that the gods were blessing your babies to make them this large. You want them to be larger, right? And the people who had larger children would be of higher status, because to them that's the ideal, right? And so the Canaanite gods were all fertility gods, and this could be evidence of this. The most important were Baal and Asherah. Now, Asherah typically is understood to be Baal's mother. Some later evidence is they thought that this was a married couple, but the older origins of these two gods were Asherah's the mother, and there was another male god who was the father, and Baal was their son. But these are both fertility gods, male and female, and we know that these are the two gods that are most mentioned in the Old Testament because the Israelites begin to worship these two false gods. Particularly, there's the story of Baal, the prophets of Baal, that Elijah goes up against them famously. And Asherah, there's all these Asherah poles, which are carved totems that were put in the high places around Israel, and the good kings would go around and they'd cut down the Asherah poles and destroy the high places. And the bad kings would set up Asherah poles and all the rest. So the Israelites in the later years were turning to these Canaanite gods, who were fertility gods, which means they were doing this very same thing that God was destroying the Canaanites before them for doing, essentially. Okay? There's also a more obscure god named Moloch. In fact, he's so obscure that some have argued that it's not a god at all, it's just a practice of sacrifice. But the one thing we do know about Moloch from the biblical text is that Moloch is specifically identified with child sacrifice. And again, this would be a significant part of a society that was engaging in selective breeding for large people. On the one hand, they would need fertility gods and goddesses to make sure they had lots and lots of kids. And on the other hand, they would need a god to sacrifice the kids who did not measure up to. And that was Moloch. Okay? And the specific verses in which the god Moloch is mentioned in the Bible is God telling the Israelites, anybody who sacrifices their children or their seed to Moloch is, anathema. They're bad. Cut them off, right? Don't do that. Okay? And why would you do that? Well, if you have a child that is too small or is some defect that you don't like, get rid of him. Okay? Have a better one next time. And again, this is a practice that occurred often in the ancient world. An example is Sparta, ancient Sparta, which would be much later than this period. But in Sparta, if children were born that had defects or were not up to their physical standards, they would leave them out in the wilderness to die. And that is and Sparta was known to be a warrior nation, an ancient warrior nation. And so again, this same practice of getting rid of people who are born who do not measure up physically and intentionally breeding larger, stronger, faster people because they're a warrior nation and a warrior class, and their whole society is oriented around war and fighting others and being large and killing people in battle and dominating your enemies. And this is what God is trying to prevent human society from becoming. Okay, in this interpretation. Okay. Now we get to Joshua. And one thing that it says in Joshua is the leader who takes over after Moses and takes Israel into the promised land. After Moses specifically says, eliminate these large people quickly, it says here in Joshua 11, there were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod some remained. The Anakim are a reference to the large people. Okay, so it specifically mentions that when Joshua was through with his conquests of the promised land, there were only a few of these large people left in these three cities. And one of these is Gath, where Goliath is from later, when David comes on the scene much, much later. So here is the passage about Goliath from the later part where David comes along. Now, at this time, the Israelites had been in the land for a long time, several generations. You're looking well past the period of the Judges, which occurs after Joshua. That's actually a pretty long period. And so the question is, okay, so the Israelites have been in this land for a long, long time, but there are still these large people around. And that means, in my interpretation, what this means is that the Israelites had not finished the job. The fact that there are these large people still in the land means that it wasn't finished. Okay, and it specifically says in Joshua it wasn't quite finished, but it was important that most of them were gone. Okay, so most of them are gone, but there were still a few around, like Goliath. Now, there is, again, I've said this, where it says his height here is 6 cubits and a span. There's controversy about how tall that means. It's usually interpreted 9 feet 9 inches. But what's not open to interpretation is the rest of the description. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. A shekel is a well-defined ancient weight. It was used for thousands of years, close to it. It was used in ancient Carthage. We know what this was. A shekel was about 11 grams. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. To show you how much that is, the helmet is 120 pounds. The spear point is about 14.5 pounds. Now go to a weight room and pick up weights. Pick up a 10-pound weight and a 5-pound weight, and pick that up in one hand. Now imagine that at the end of a really long spear. Now you're getting the point of how big this spear was and the kind of strength someone would have to actually wield it. And I think of a 120-pound helmet on your head, just on your head. That's not even talking about the rest of his armor, which probably weighed a whole lot more than that. I think 9'9" is a reasonable interpretation for somebody like that. And okay. And this is 2 Samuel, and there was war with the Philistines again at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jari, Oregon, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Now, some people claim that this is the same Goliath, and therefore there's an inconsistency with the story of David, where David killed Goliath. But I'm thinking some texts change the name here. I'm using the NASB, which is more accurate to the original text. Some people change the name and give this Goliath a different name. But names get reused. This is much later than the David story, so I'm guessing this is a relative of the original Goliath that has the same name. That seems reasonable to me. There's a lot of really dumb criticisms of the first chapters of Genesis that claim, well, this person has the same name as this person, so they must be the same person. No, probably different people with the same name. I don't understand why that's a big deal. But again, these people, these large people, are specifically mentioned as being killed by the Israelites during the time of David. Now, the reason why David is so important, I'm going to argue in the narrative, is that after all this period of the judges, David is the one who comes on the scene and says, "Look, this is why we're here. We're supposed to do this. I'm going to go out there, I'm going to fight Goliath, and I'm going to kill him because this is what God has ordained that we do. This is God's mission for the Israelites in this interpretation." And David says, "Look, if God is going to do this for us, if this is what God wants us to do, we won't fail." Okay? And he goes out there and he does it. And then in the time of David, over and over again, it is mentioned that in the time of David's kingship, that when they war against the Philistines, it mentions specifically when they kill these large people. And it happens several times. Okay? There are several examples of this where the mighty men of David go out and they kill large champions of the Philistines. They're left over after the original conquest. Okay? So I'm going to read this passage again after we've gone through all of this, okay, and see if it makes sense to you. "Now it came about when mankind began to multiply on the face of the land," which is exactly what God wanted them to do, but they multiplied and multiplied on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, and the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Naughty, naughty. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not remain with man forever, because he is also flesh. I'm going to term limit him. So they can't do this anymore. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them." Selective breeding, eugenics program. "Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown, who dominated the earth and controlled it through force of arms. And then the Lord said that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually." Only wanted power, only wanted to dominate everybody, to control everything. It's not the kind of freedom that God wanted for human beings. Now, this gives a consistent narrative, at least all the way through the time of David, which, again, I got to emphasize, I didn't intend to do this from the beginning here. I was just looking at Genesis 6, but it began to shed a light on the rest of the Old Testament narrative. Why Canaan? Why kill everyone in the flood? What's going on with the Tower of Babel? Why is David so important? Why does it constantly mention these large people and talk about eliminating them? I'm saying this is the purpose of the flood. There was an intent that God had for human society that was destroyed at the fall. Okay? And so God's like, whatever, you guys are sinners now, come what may. But then they get so bad that God realized there's no reason to allow this to continue. It's so terrible. They're just breeding everybody. Everything is rigid and controlled. Everyone's just fighting for power. They've even just malformed and just morphed the human race into something that I did not intend. So he destroys them all with a flood and starts over. Now, if you've watched the earlier video on catastrophic plate tectonics, there's a reason why the flood cannot happen again. But biblically, God only just promises not to destroy the earth by flood again. And so that mechanism for controlling this tendency in human society is no longer available to God after the flood. And so he has to intervene and stop this by other means. Stop it from happening. And so he intervenes at various times, both at the flood and after the flood, in human history to prevent us from reverting to the antediluvian model of selective breeding, trying to make larger and larger humans and dominate the people around us through a highly controlled society. which also includes lots of child sacrifice, preventing certain people from breeding because they don't measure up physically. Okay. That makes sense of the Tower of Babel, where they don't talk about large people at the Tower of Babel, but they do talk about centralized power. Everybody in one place, as one society that has this one building that their society is structured around. And it's almost like they're worshiping it. Okay, it's reaching up to heaven, so it sort of takes a religious significance. And God intervenes and spreads them over the face of the earth to make sure they cannot centralize power. The genocide of the Canaanites is, again, we talked quite a bit about that, where God is using the Israelites to prevent the Canaanites from reestablishing the antediluvian order, the antediluvian world order. Now, what if this had not happened? What if the Canaanites had been allowed to continue in doing what they were doing? Could they have taken over most or the whole world, or at least won enough victories in battle against other developing ancient cultures that the other cultures began to copy what they were doing? God is nipping this thing at the bud here in this interpretation. He uses the Israelites to do it. And this is why he chooses the promised land to be where it is. It's not because there's something special about the land. It's because the people who lived there were evil. That's what we're told in Genesis 15. I'm suggesting what it was that they were doing that was so evil and why God singles them out for destruction versus all the other evil societies on earth at the time. Okay? It was because of the people who were there, not so much something special about the land, that God promises this land to the people, which is often what we get. What we tend to think about the promised land is there's something special about the land, but the only thing that's special about the land is that it's the land God promised Abraham in Genesis 12. But we already know that God knew what his plan was, because in Genesis 15 he says what it is. His plan is to, get rid of the Amorites because they're going to be really evil. They have to stop them. And this goes all the way through to the narrative of the taking of the promised land and King David, whose singular famous episode is confronting a giant, the largest of the large ones, the 9'9" behemoth person, maybe the largest one they'd ever seen, who was a warrior and who was taunting the Israelites and taunting God and saying, we're going to take over the world and you can't stop us. And David says, nope, this is why we are here. This is our purpose. This is why God sent us here. This is our mission. And if nobody else is going to do it, I'll do it. I'll take this guy out because God has ordained that it happen one way or the other. And he goes and he kills Goliath. And David becomes an important figure in the whole Bible. And Jesus is then in the line of David. And it's always said Jesus is in the line of David. Why David? Out of all the other people in David's line who are important, we're talking Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we're talking Noah, Adam. Why is it always said that Jesus is in the line of David? Because Jesus Christ is the true and final Son of God. He is the only true claimant to that title. He's the only human being who can really claim to be the Son of God correctly. And he takes this title for himself. All the original sons of God who claimed to be that were not. They were imposters to that title. And they were trying to do things that God did not want them to do, and God prevented them from doing it. And he gave that title to his one and only Son, Jesus Christ, to take command of the earth, essentially. That this is now the person who's the one person who has declared victory over all these human rebels against God. It really, this interpretation is super compelling. It is speculative, but it does seem to make sense of a lot of disparate things about Scripture, things that otherwise don't have clear explanations. And it's just possible that this one little piece of information, which really is just God didn't like societies that engaged in selective breeding to breed large people for war. That's just one very simple idea. What if the original author of Genesis, the original audience of Genesis, understood this to be the case, and it only made it into the text tangentially, not clearly stated, because everyone at the time understood this. Remember this: the 10 spies who came back said the Nephilim are there, and nobody asks, nobody says, well, the Nephilim were killed in the flood. The term Nephilim, apparently they knew what that meant. It meant a bred race of warriors who are larger physically than other people. What if they understood that to be the case? And what if that's kind of why today we don't experience this? We don't experience races of people who are larger. Selective breeding and eugenics, whenever it's been tried, it got stamped down once again in the 20th century before it even got that far, or if it's even possible to breed people that large again. I don't even know. Maybe the genetics are all gone at this point. Certainly Noah was in the same line as all the other antediluvian people. He may have had some left in him. I don't know, that were maybe bred by the Canaanites and then wiped out. It may not even be possible anymore. But we know now that this is bad, and we don't do it anymore, generally. And when it is done, we realize that it is bad, that it is a great evil, and it shouldn't be done. And we say, you can't do that. And people still kill their babies all over the earth. That's happening today, and it's not just abortion. In China, for example, there's a preponderance of male children because of the one-child policy. A lot of parents killed their baby daughters because they wanted their one child to be a son. But that's a little different than what's going on here. That's certainly bad and sinful. But what's going on here is an entire society that we can only imagine because it doesn't exist. The closest thing you could get probably today is North Korea, of the kind of power one person can wield over a large number of people. But a whole society oriented towards selective breeding, trying to breed superior people, and even today that would look different because physical size isn't important anymore. It may be that this is never going to be a problem again because of the firearm. It says, God created man, but cult created man equal. Maybe it's not a problem at this point in history. Who knows? But back then it certainly could have been. And again, this is something that is very difficult for us to imagine to be the case. But you have to kind of put yourself into an ancient mindset to even see this. And that's why it's very hard. My interpretation of this has potentially been overlooked because it's very hard to imagine. But anyway, so that's my speculative interpretation. I think it's super compelling. Next time, we're going to get into my real interest in this subject of origins, evolution, and all the rest, the science side of things. So stick around for that. There's going to be several episodes on that. We're going to talk about progressive creation, which is Craig's view. I'm going to do a bonus episode at the end about the Evangelical Theological Society meeting that occurred a month or two after Craig finished this series. There's some really interesting stuff from that. So stick around for that. I'm not sure how many episodes more there's going to be. Maybe as few as 3 or 2 even. At least 3, I'd say. Maybe as many as 5 or 6. But Craig's book comes out later this month. I believe it's September 23rd is the release date for Craig's book on the historical Adam, which is his final work on all this subject before he's started working on his systematic theology. So I'm going to read that book. and we'll see what, if anything, Craig has to add to the information in his class. It's possible the next time I do a video I'll have actually read the book already, so we'll see how that goes. All right, till next time, thanks, bye.